tonight. It's okay. Does anybody else need a copy of this? Does Rich have his?
I think he's got his. She don't.
Okay. I got one. Yeah. You got one.
Come here.
Before we get to our study on prayer, I would like to discuss or to talk about, I think that there is a difference between when we talk about theology and affection. Theology deals with the mind and the knowledge. Theology deals with the technical aspect, probably from God's point of view, whereas how does it feel from the heart? For instance, in Luke chapter 10 and verse 27, Luke 10:27 says, and he answering said, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. So Luke 10:26 and 27, Luke 10:27 gives us the outworking of what we know. As a matter of fact, God's law is to be obeyed no matter how we feel about it. If you are a believer, you are to obey God's law because God is God. Now, I'm trying to figure out how can we translate theology into the reality of our hearts. Knowing the Bible and making the application of the Bible are two different things. I want to ask you a question. What is the gospel? I'm going to give you three options. What is the gospel? The gospel is for one, the unbeliever, two, for the unsaved, or three, both of the above.
Both of the above.
Too often, most people look at the gospel as being only the Roman road, and they assume that the gospel is only for the initial coming into salvation, is just being saved. But the gospel has a lot more to say to the believer, and it is to continue on into the life of the believer. Now, when we say, briefly, when we say someone is being saved, the Bible speaks of it in different terms to help us understand what does it mean to be saved. Let me give you some thoughts. One term that's constantly used or is used in the Bible is called regeneration. In other words, how do we explain what it means for a person to be saved? The names given to regeneration by biblical writers has to do with what takes place in the life of a person who has been saved. In 1 John chapter 2, verses 2 and verse 29, 1 John chapter 2 and verse 29, John calls it the begetting. The begetting. That's the term used when a person becomes a Christian. It's the begetting. 1 John chapter 2 verse 29. Who has that? Okay, go.
If you know that he is righteous, you know the very one that does righteousness in both of you.
1 John 2:29. Okay. Born of him. The beget. All right. Jesus and James and John and Peter, first in John 3 through verse 8, Jesus, John, James, and Peter calls it the new birth. Calls it the new birth. John and Paul describes it as the passing from death unto life. In other words, we're using terms, what takes place in salvation. John and Paul describes it as a passing from death unto life and calls it a resurrection. 1 John 3:14. Paul generally refers to it as a recreation. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 17. But he also, Paul, calls it a painful dying in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20. And as a death in Romans 6:18, so does Christ himself. But Jesus elsewhere sets forth this concept of regeneration as an enlightenment. An enlightenment. You're giving a new thought process. While James, it is one case as implanting in James 1:21. It cannot be at once a begetting and a birth and a dying and a resurrection and a creation, an implantation and an illumination. It is a change that takes place at the moment of salvation, but it continues to do that. And let me give you a definition. We'll quit with this, with the definition of regeneration, which is exactly what it is, or the new birth, is the divine side of that change of heart, which viewed from the human side we'll call conversion. There's been a conversion. When we look at it from our human side and we see what happens from a divine side, there is a conversion from our understanding from a human side to a divine side. We're now not looking at life from our human side, but we're looking at it from God's divine side. It is God's turning the soul to himself. What conversion does, you have been converted from your mindset to God's mindset. In other words, prior to salvation, you were all about yourself. You lived and died yourself. You acted and behaved unto yourself. When you became a believer, there was a conversion made that you became conscious of the presence of God. Conversion begins being the soul's turning itself to God, of which God's turning it is both an accomplishment and a cause. So regeneration means